On Monday, there was a moment at the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act where we found out that CSIS advised the government that there was no national security threat as defined by law during the Freedom Convoy last February. Now, to talk about this in more detail is political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, why is this so important?
It's so important, Hal, because it's key to whether or not the government was justified in invoking the Emergencies Act. The law spells out that this is not a normal law, that the Emergencies Act can't be invoked at the drop of a hat. There have to be certain conditions met. One of them is that it has to deal with an emergency that no other law in Canada can handle. After you clear that hurdle, you have to say, okay, is there a threat to national security? Because there's two different types of emergencies that can be invoked. The one that the Trudeau government invoked to deal with the convoy was a public order emergency. To invoke that, there has to be a threat to national security as defined by Section 2 of the Canadian Intelligence Security Services Act, CSIS. Um, it's not just, well, we feel like there's a problem. There is a legal definition of what constitutes a national security threat. Section 2 of the National CSIS Act says things like espionage or sabotage. David Viano, the director of CSIS, in his witness testimony, he was not appearing. This is his witness statement. He'll be appearing later. Said that there was no sabotage or espionage to constitute a national security threat. Were people trying to overthrow the government using violent means? No, they weren't. They weren't. Sure, everyone talks about this memorandum of understanding, trying to claim that the Senate and the Governor General will replace the cabinet. Well, that's not the same thing as trying to overthrow the government. Sorry, there was no seditious movement. Is there foreign interference, foreign influence? Well, some people have said, well, yes, there were those American donations. That's proof. And I've been saying since they invoked the Emergencies Act that they were going to hang their hat on the foreign funding. But David Viano of CSIS, in his report to Cabinet, which went to them on December 13th, said, no, this does not constitute a foreign threat. And, it has to be a foreign state actor involved. There has to be some real threat, and there simply isn't. So if CSIS says there's no national security threat, that should tell you that they went too far in invoking the law. But Rob Stewart, who was then deputy minister in the Public Safety Department, the most powerful bureaucrat under Marco Mendicino, he said, well, yes, but they were getting other information from people who didn't use that test, and Cabinet decided that it was justified in invoking the act. That doesn't matter how Cabinet feels. The law is specific. Has to be a national security threat as defined by Section 2 of the CSIS Act.
So, Brian, CSIS says there is no national security threat during the Freedom Convoy. Now, we've also seen the email where Police Commissioner Brenda Leckie said there were more tools that they hadn't used, and the discovery that the Trudeau government shut down attempts by bureaucrats to meet with protesters. Do you get the sense that maybe the rationale for invoking the act has simply fallen apart?
I've been feeling that way since about the first week, maybe the first week and a half of testimony. You have to sit there and listen and see. You don't know what you don't know, as the saying goes. And so we didn't know what we were going to hear at the Emergencies Act inquiry. Maybe there would be evidence that had never come forward before to say, yes, this was absolutely justified. But this CSIS threat assessment saying there was no threat to national security, that doesn't mean the convoy wasn't a pain in the butt. Doesn't mean that police weren't right to clear the streets after 3 weeks. Doesn't mean any of that. There is just a specific legal definition, and CSIS said it's not there. The RCMP commissioner says we have more tools, and in fact, this morning she was talking about that in her own testimony, that there were more tools available. All of this, and then the testimony the other day about how ministers stepped in and told their officials, no, you will not meet with them. That tells you that there was no serious attempt to do anything but move towards the Emergencies Act. And according to some testimony, there were discussions of invoking the Emergencies Act as early as February 4th, which is the start of the second weekend, I believe, going by memory here. I don't have the calendar up in front of me. But by February 4th, Minister Blair was talking about using the Emergencies Act And by the 14th, they did it. But I don't know if we talked about this last week. When we saw the evidence of a phone call between Justin Trudeau and Ontario Premier Doug Ford on February 9th, the evening of February 9th, Trudeau said to Ford, who said, I'm going to bring in my Emergencies Act, I'm going to give police more powers. Trudeau said, police don't need more powers, they need to do their job. A few days later, he changed his mind.
Brian, if an election was called today, a new poll, a new survey says it's actually good news for the Conservative Party of Canada and Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, so an election were held today, it'd be 36% nationally for the Conservatives, 34% for the Liberals. Now, I always caution people, national numbers don't matter. You know, they're interesting, but you have to look at where things are regionally. Because let's say that 36% were being driven by Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives getting 75% in Alberta, 75% in Saskatchewan, et cetera. But they're not winning in Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada. They're not going to form government. You know, you've got to have it spread out across the country and win seats, not just run up the score in one riding or a handful of ridings and not win in the others. The good news for Poilievre and the Conservatives here is that they've got a slight lead in Ontario. They're ahead by, I believe, 2 points. The national numbers mirror the Ontario numbers. So it's still very tight in terms of national numbers, in terms of Ontario. There's definitely a strong possibility that if these results showed up, that it would be the Conservatives forming a minority government. That's very much a possibility. But you know, a lot of time between now and the next election, campaigns matter. And of course, there's all the talk about whether Justin Trudeau even sticks around, and if he doesn't, who his replacement will be. You know, so many factors to consider between now and then. But I think the poll shows that Poilievre is reaching out to voters in the ways that he needs to, and I think a lot of that is talking about cost of living issues, inflation, being able to buy a house, things that matter to Canadians, instead of focusing in on issues that'll make his base happy but not win over those swing voters.
Are there any rumblings coming out of Ottawa that we could potentially be going to the polls? Maybe not this fall, but how about early spring?
I haven't heard those. And of course, I was talking quite a bit a few months ago about the possibility of us being in an election right about now, actually. I think this week would have been one of the timeframes that the Trudeau Liberals would have looked at if they thought they had an easy win coming out of Pierre Poilievre winning the Conservative leadership. But I'm surprised by a couple of things. One, they didn't go that route. Okay, the economic numbers aren't great. Inflation's still really high. They're going to try and battle it out, but strangely, they haven't tried to define Pierre Poilievre. If I was them, again, we're talking about trying to reach swing voters, people who can be swayed either way. I would have had attack ads ready to go on Pierre Poilievre on everything from Bitcoin, which right now is tanked with that big bankruptcy in the U.S. I would have attack ads on him about the convoy, because that's not something that a lot of middle of the road voters are enamored with. And so they could be convinced either way. I'd be going at them over all kinds of issues. They haven't done that on anything. And I'm sitting there looking, going, oh, if I could run a war room attack ad against them, why aren't you? So I'm puzzled as to what their strategy is here. I thought they would have come out swinging hard against him. They haven't. He's come out swinging hard against them, and he's getting results in the polls.
Brian, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in Indonesia for the G20 summit. Now, he's been under some pressure to do something about a CSIS report that China meddled in Canada's elections. Trudeau spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping at the summit. Now, before we chat about what Trudeau said, what do we know about the allegations?
The allegations are that back in 2019, the Chinese government, using their consulate here in Toronto, ran a campaign of foreign interference, of influence. We can't say for sure that the candidates involved knew what was happening, but according to the report, first broken by Sam Cooper over at Global, so kudos to him for that, getting that report. According to the report, 11 candidates, Liberals and Conservatives, we don't know how many of each, but Liberals and Conservatives were identified by the Chinese government as being on their side or persuadable. A sum of $250,000 was dispersed to some of the money going to these candidates through intermediaries, and also that there were attempts to place staff who would try and direct or deflect the candidate depending on the issue towards a position more in line with Beijing. That has to be worrisome. We don't know how many of these candidates were elected, if any. We don't know if any of them are in government, in cabinet. Are they shadow ministers? That seems unlikely given the strong anti-China stance that the Conservatives have taken of late, or strong against President Xi, as opposed to the Chinese people. But these are very concerning. So Trudeau, he's been asked about this multiple times now. So has Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly. None of them have ever said that report is false. That's fake news. CSIS never said anything. So we have to believe that the reporting is accurate. What we're told now is that on the sidelines of the G20, Trudeau bumped into Xi in the hallway. They had a face-to-face discussion. All we know from a readout, we don't know exactly what was said, but the readout says that they did raise the issue. How forcefully? I don't know. But this is the sort of thing that he should raise. And look, this is not a knock against the Liberal Party, because it's Liberals and Conservatives. This is a nonpartisan issue. This is about the integrity of our elections. I've been disappointed in the Prime Minister's statement so far and his unwillingness to denounce this. I hope that he was strong with President Xi, but we simply don't know.
Brian, the RCMP charged a Chinese national with espionage this week, allegedly stealing secrets while working at Hydro-Quebec. Tell me more.
So this is a gentleman who lived in Candiac, just south of Montreal, and had a job working for several years at Hydro-Quebec. Not sure exactly what secrets were being stolen, but this is the type of espionage that China engages in mostly. It's not trying to steal state secrets. It tries to influence policy with politicians, but it tries to steal industrial secrets. I remember years ago, about 20 odd years ago, I was working at a bureaucratic position in Ottawa, and the building next door was Nortel. And one day the police showed up and were arresting a couple of people for the same reason, sending these secrets back to China, stealing secrets from the tech giant. It wasn't the first time and it wasn't the last time that had happened. And we generally see that more on the industrial side than we do on the political, although there have been, I think it was more with Russia trying to get military secrets. They're stuck in the Cold War. China wants to steal everything else. But, it does show that the RCMP working on this, using this type of information that was in the CSIS report on the election, can get results. And so what I want to see is, I'd like to see the names of the candidates that got the assistance, but I'd also like to see those who perpetrated this plan to either be charged or expelled from the country.
Brian, the Canada Border Services Agency was supposed to turn over documents on who got money from the $54 million ArriveCAN app, but they did not. So now what?
Well, now the Commons Committee that demanded it has told them, okay, get back to it. We want this information. CBSA has tried to say they don't know the names of some of the subcontractors, and it'll be hard for them to deliver that. But we know in one example, there was a company that was paid $2 million to develop part of the app. All they did was hire other people to work on it, but they got $2 million. Well, call them up and say, you got the money. Who did you hire and what did they do? We need to know. The government paid the invoices, or they paid the people that paid the invoices. They can get this information. This isn't the first time that bureaucrats working under the Trudeau government have refused to release information. You remember Ian Shugart getting chastised for not releasing information related to the Winnipeg lab. This sort of thing can't be allowed to continue to happen. So there was quite the tongue lashing from committee chair Kelly McCauley, and told to get back to it and bring this information to committee forthwith. If that doesn't happen, then what we might see is the committee recommend that this bureaucrat be called before the full House and then censured, which, again, it happened a couple of years ago, but having it happen twice would be quite shocking.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.